Hello and welcome. Hi, I'm Dave. This tutorial is part of a beginner CSS series. I'll be using the Chrome web browser, the Visual Studio Code editor, and the live server extension for Visual Studio Code to view the web page. There are links to these tools, starter code files, and all resources in the description below. Today we're going to discuss the CSS position property. You can see on the left I've got Visual Studio Code, on the right I've got Chrome, and we're using the live server extension, so any changes we make in our HTML or CSS today should immediately show up over here in the browser. Now first let's look at the HTML page that I have here on the left in Visual Studio Code, and you can see it's a basic layout, and I'm really using more divs than I'm normally comfortable with. All of these div elements, they are block elements, but they are not semantic. They do not provide any additional meaning to a page, and they don't really help accessibility at all. So in a typical project, I wouldn't use a lot of divs, but they are good for today's example. So you can see we have an outer container, and this outer container in the browser is a dashed black border that outlines this container. And then we have an inner container, and it is a solid blue line here in the inner container. And then inside of this inner container, and you can't see them right now, we have four other divs. They all have the class of box, but then each has an individual class: absolute, relative, fixed, and sticky, and those are possible values for the position property, and we'll look at each of those. Let's jump over to the style.css file. You can see I'm importing in that Roboto font, as I have been in the last several tutorials for this CSS series. And then I guess I have the lobster font here too, although I'm not using it right now. I've also got this CSS reset already in place with a margin of 0, padding of 0, and box sizing equal to border box. For the body, we're using that Roboto font family, and then we also have a font size of 1.5 rems, and then a min height of 200 viewport units. So that means, besides what you see here, we've got another full page that we can scroll down to, and we'll need that in just a little bit. Then we have the styles for the outer container already. Here you can see the dashed border, it's 3 pixels. We've got a width and a height set on it just for this example, and a top and bottom margin of 40 pixels. The auto for left and right centers the container. And then we'll see something very similar here for the inner container. Of course, the different styles, just sizing it a little differently, and the color and size of the border. And then we have the box class that applies to the 4 divs that you cannot currently see. You can't see them because their font color is white. Other than that, they are a box with 150 pixels width and height, and a little bit of padding in there. Okay, with all of that said, let's go ahead and style our first class, and that was the absolute class. So what we'll do for it is set a background color that's different than the others so we can tell them apart a little better. Let's just set that to a blue. We'll use hexadecimal there. And then let's go ahead and set the position. But the first position value we're going to use is static, and that is the default of all elements. They're static just already when you put them on the page. So essentially it's not going to change anything. I just wanted you to see that value to know that's the default even if you don't set it. So now let's go ahead and set a position of absolute and see what we get when we save. It really didn't change anything, and that's because we didn't set any other value. When we set these values, we need to go ahead and set a top, left, right, or bottom. We don't have to set all of them, but it needs at least one to change where it's at. So let's set the top to 0, see what we get. It moved it all the way to the top of the browser. Now what if we set left to 0? Now it moved it all the way to the left, so it's in the upper left corner. So absolute positioning needs a relative parent. And if it doesn't have an ancestor element that is positioned relative, then it takes the initial boundary or the initial box, which is essentially the browser window. And so that's why it went up here to the top and then the left when we set that position. But now we can scroll up and we can set a position on this outer container. You see I'll set the position to relative, And now look what happens to our absolute box. It now has an ancestor that is positioned relative, so this positioning is no longer relative to the browser window. It's relative to this ancestor that has the position set to relative. But what if we set the position to relative on more than one ancestor? We'll do that here if I could spell relative again. And I'll save, and now you can see this is back where we started inside the inner container, and that is because it picks the ancestor that is closest to it. And so our box started inside of this inner container. So with the outer container set to relative and the inner container set to relative, it picks the closest one, the nearest one, and that is the inner container. So we're back here. Now, as you might have guessed, the zeros are essentially the default choices there. So if we save, we don't really see a change from position absolute with the top and left 0 to where they are now. Of course, if we change which ancestor it was relative to, we would see a change as it would move to whichever ancestor it was relative to. However, we can put in other values. So let's do something like 100 pixels. And then we could also do left 50 pixels and see what happens. And now it moved. It's once again absolutely positioned, but it's relative to this inner container, and it moved down 100 pixels and it moved to the right, essentially 50 pixels from the left. That's how you want to read that, and you would say from the top. So that's a good way to read those, from the top, from the left. So let's once again change the position relative and put it on the outer container only and save, and now we can see the same thing. We have moved 100 pixels and 50 pixels as we set right here. Okay, I'm going to switch these values back to 0 to get our absolute box out of the way. And now we'll look at the next box, which is the relative one that we have inside the inner container. So here we'll say relative for the relative class. Let's set a different background color. Let's go with red on this one. And then after that, we can save that much and we see it already. After that, we're going to say position relative, and we already know that won't change anything by just setting that much. But now if I were to say top and here say 100 pixels, and then say left, and here I could say 100 pixels also, it's going to move 100 pixels from the top and 100 pixels from the left. So much like we saw the absolute do when it was relative to its parent container. And now relative here means it's going to be relative to its parent container already without having to define that relative on the parent. So inside of here, by setting it relative, it's always going to be relative to its parent container. Let's scroll up for some more room, and let's change that top by a few more pixels, maybe 300 pixels, and get our relative block out of the way as well. And now we can pick our fixed class. And here let's give this a background color of green. If I did it with hex, I don't like the bright color I get there. So if I say green, I get a darker green color. So that's what I'm going with. Position is going to be fixed. And here, well, not absolute, we just want fixed. And then here, we're going to say, well, let's just not put anything yet. And we'll save. And there we can see our fixed box. But now let's say something like top, and this will be 100 pixels. And if I save, notice now it just moved 100 pixels from the top, and we can confirm that by removing our position relative here to make sure it's not responding to this outer container. And if we save, now we have our absolute up here in the corner, but the fix stayed exactly where it was. So it's only 100 pixels from the top. And then after that, what will happen is it will just stay right there, even if we scroll. So that's what it means to be in a fixed position. So I scroll, and that's why we have that 200 viewport unit height, so I could scroll down to a second page. Our fixed block is staying in a fixed position the entire time. And so it's out of the flow of the page, just like our other blocks are. but it is never moving, even when we scroll the page. And this is a good time to point out that the fixed block is over the absolute block right now. That is decided by what element comes first and what element comes last in the HTML. So if we go back to the HTML and I took this fixed div and I put it before the absolute div, and now I save, absolute's on top. But that's not always convenient when we're working with pages to go and change the structure of the HTML. So we can also do this with CSS. If we want that absolute block on top, we would just come over here and change the z-index. You might call that Z, but I call it Z, the z-index. And the default value is 0, so that's not going to change anything. But if we give it a higher value, and we don't need to go 10 or 20 or 100 higher, we can just go 1 higher and save, and now our absolute block is on top of the fixed block. But I can scroll and the absolute block goes away, our fixed block is still there. Okay, we've got one more left, and that is sticky. Sticky is just a little different than fixed. And that's because it will stay in its normal flow until it reaches a spot that you have defined. So here we're going to say background color, and let's just make this black. And then we'll say position sticky, and we can save. And there it is. And now we haven't put any spot, essentially, say a top, where it would stick. So right now if we scroll, it just scrolls right off the page. But we could say top 0 and save. And now let's see what happens when we scroll. I scroll, our sticky block stays at 0 momentarily, but it's running out of the container. Notice when the container that it is in reaches the end and begins to scroll off the page, then the sticky block goes ahead and scrolls off the page, unlike the fixed. So now when we scroll back down, it stays. And so maybe we could push that down a little further or something, but overall, or I could make this a little longer, but overall you see it stick at the top, and then it moves again when the container catches up to it and scrolls off the page. Okay, it's good to see all these examples, but it's better to even put some of them to use, and you will see how they're used in page construction. So I've got a quick example coming up for that. Before we do that, I want to go back to something we talked about a few lessons ago, and that's how to make something disappear. We covered display none, and we covered the opacity, where we could make something fade all the way down to being not only see-through but completely disappearing. But I said both of those were not good for accessibility. Display none completely removes it from the page. A screen reader would not read what we were doing. Opacity makes it invisible, and it might not be the best way to do what we're talking about. But what if we had something that needed to still be part of the document, but we wanted it off the page? Well, position absolute is great for that. So I'm going to go ahead and comment out, well, we don't really need to comment this out. I'll just change this value, because we would take the left value, for example, and I'll set it to minus 10,000 pixels and save. Notice it's gone, but it's still part of the document. It's still in our HTML, and when it's processed by a screen reader, it would still be read. Say it was a paragraph or the label for an input, and that's important to accessibility. So oftentimes when I need to remove something visibly from a page, but I still need it to be part of the page for accessibility reasons, I position it absolute and I move it, say a random number here, but minus 10,000 pixels is kind of my go-to, way off to the left, where it will not be seen, but it will still be read. So I'll change this back, but overall, just remember that trick for taking something off of the page. Okay, now let's move on to our second example. So what I'm going to do is grab everything we see here from line 13 down to line 28, if I can get to the right spot. line 28, and comment that out. I do that with Shift, Alt, and the letter A in Visual Studio Code. Now I'm going to grab the rest of the HTML I have here and uncomment it, and I do that the same way, Shift, Alt, and the letter A. And now you can see I have a button element with a class of social, and it just has this little rocket emoji on it. After that, I've got some sections, 1, 2, 3 sections. Each one has an ID, 1, 2, and 3. Inside each section there is a header with a class of blue, header 1, a header with a class of red, header 2, and a header with a class of green, which is header 3. Then you can see each one has an H2 heading inside of it, just to have a little bit of text, 1, 2, and 3 as well. And then there is a footer, and inside the footer we have anchor links to those different parts of the page, 1, 2, and 3. If you remember from learning basic HTML, you don't just have to link away from a page, you can link to different parts of a page with that anchor link, and we're linking back to each ID for each section. So I'm going to save this now, and we see the basic HTML over here to the right. Now I'm going to jump back to the CSS. I'll leave all of this here because it won't hurt anything, but I'm going to put in a dividing line and a reminder for you that will be available in the source code that says remember how to make things disappear that we just talked about. Now after that we can apply some new styles to what we now have in our HTML, but I'll leave these old styles in there as well as leaving in the commented out divs from the first part of this tutorial. Okay, now we're going to take each section element and we're going to set the height of each section to 100 viewport units. So now you can see on the first page we have header 1 and the rocket is here too. Then we have a second page with header 2 and a third page with header 3. And eventually we have a footer with 3 links in it as well. Okay, let's scroll up a little bit, and then after this section we can go ahead and define a, let's say, a blue class, because we need one for each color that we had. This would be background color, and I'm going to choose blue here. Now at the end of this line I can press Shift, Alt, and the down arrow to copy down a couple of times, and then I'm going to change this one to red, and I'll change this hex color to red, and then this last one will be green, and I'm going to change this to the keyword green because I like that green just a little bit better. So now I'll save, and we can see the header colors have changed for each page. After that, let's put in some styles for the header and the footer. They can share these styles. So we have header, comma, footer, and it will apply to both. So I'll say color, and we'll set the text to white. Then we'll set the text align to center. Then let's set the height of the header and the footer both to 100 pixels, and let's pick a big font size. So let's go with like 5 rems here and save. And we can see that got very big for each one. Okay, time to scroll just a little bit more, and now a couple of styles just for the header. We'll say position. This will be sticky, or I should say headers, because there is more than one header element. And then the top will be 0. And so that is set for all 3 header elements that we have on the page now. Now we'll set some style for the footer. Say background dash color. And let's make this one black. Now let's set the position to fixed. And this will give us something to talk about and compare to sticky. And we'll set the bottom to 0. And we'll see what we get with that. Okay, so what we have so far is header 1. Now we still have this rocket button above, and then it's stopping at the top. Notice we scrolled. Now the word 1 disappeared, but header 1 stops at the top. Here comes header 2. Now it stops at the top, and the text scrolled on up, and now here's header 3. Now our bottom here, it looks like we got maybe a little bit of a large font issue there. So let's pull this font size 5 out of the definition for both, and let's just put it here in the header. If we save, now we get more what I wanted to see down here. And notice, since we used position fixed, it pulled it out of the normal flow of the page. What would normally be a block element and span the full width here is not spanning the full width now. So what we would need to do if we were going to use position fixed is set the width to 100%, and then our footer would work. But there is a fix also. Even though it's not really going to scroll or move, that we just always want it to be in place, we could just set this to position sticky and set bottom to 0, and it's always going to be there. So now let's just set a little bit larger font for the footer as well. So let's say font size maybe 3 rems and all the links will stay. Okay, that looks good. So 1, 2, 3 links, and we have each of our pages as well. You can see how this is coming together already as an example. Let's scroll down just a little bit more, and under the footer I'm going to put a visited pseudo class here for the links and say that's going to be white. So our links there in the footer change to white, much easier to see. And now our rocket here at the top, our social link. So for that we'll set the background color once again, and here let's use a royal blue. After that we'll set the color to white, and let's say a font size, because it's a button and it will not already just inherit everything that we would normally inherit in paragraphs when we set that font size at the top of the page. So here we're just going to say inherit, so it catches up to the font size of everything else. Padding of 1 rem again. Now we'll set a position of fixed, and we want this to stay in the same place all the time. So let's say 30% from the top, and then the left is going to just be 0. Now this looks more like a social button, and maybe you're used to seeing several buttons over here for different social media, but it should stay in place as we scroll. So let's check it out. And it sure is. It's staying right there as we scroll past each one of our pages. So we have header 1, 2, and 3. Now if we wanted it always on top, we could go ahead and set that Z index and set that to 1, and now when we scroll we should see it on top of each header as it goes by, and we do. So an ugly example, but an example nonetheless, where each page section, say this is a single page application or a SPA if you will, each page section has its own header, and sticky allows those to scroll up and then stay in place until the content for that particular section is gone. And then we have our social media button over here with the rocket to the left. And at the bottom, I showed you how to use fixed or sticky, and you've got links to each section. Okay, now let's check out these links. So if I click 3, it instantly shows 3. 2, we're at section 2. 1, we're at section 1. There's one more thing we can do that will make that look just a little cooler if we want to when we are choosing those different sections of our single page application. And we need to put this back up here. I'll put it at the top of this new example, but it needs to go in the root element. This won't work in the body element, but we can set the scroll dash behavior to smooth. And if we save that, now let's click number 3, and notice how we get that little scroll action. That's kind of nice. So that one setting makes that scroll go from instantaneous to just a smooth little scroll between the sections. So I hope this example has showed you how you can apply the position property with CSS, and I hope the previous example gave you some pretty good differences between all the different values that you can use. Remember to keep striving for progress over perfection, and a little progress every day will go a very long way. Please give this video a like if it's helped you. And thank you for watching and subscribing. You're helping my channel grow. Have a great day, and let's write more code together very soon.